Good afternoon. I am Anto Gutierrez. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday afternoon at 3, trying to figure out the future of smart buildings. If we want to continue to call them smart buildings, we'll discuss that today. The panelists, the profiles of all the panelists are on mondaylive.org if you are interested in who we are. Just as a reminder that the views expressed here are personal, not of any company or organization. Please do post some comments and questions on the Zoom Q&A and chat boxes. And if you can complete the survey at the end, we would appreciate it. This slide deck that I'm showing is actually on mondaylive.org if you want to see any of the links that we talk about here at the beginning of the show. Just as a reminder, I mentioned this last week that for the month of February, our theme is going to be moving from smart to autonomous buildings. And we're going to have a whole month to talk about this. And the agenda for today, we'll just have a normal chit chat to see what's going on. And then just on that journey from smart to autonomous, today's sort of focus is why we're calling it smart in the first place. And we have a great guest to be able to chime in on that, Glen Allmendinger, who I'm going to bring in once we get going on that subject. So before that, a few slides. Ken Sinclair, I'll get him to talk about this in a minute about his February issue that's out and what he's doing down the road. Roger, I'm not sure if Roger is on the line here, talking about empty office buildings still devouring energy. That's something that I've heard. I'm sure we'll have a talk about that. This is something that I found in the archives of the New York Times, 1986, an article about smart buildings and the promise of the smart buildings. That's a long time ago. That's what, 35 years ago. And this quote I love. Very soon, Mr. Newman said, a system will be able to monitor internal air quality, purge bad air, and replace it with fresh air as needed. Lovely.
That's awesome.
And John Betsy, I think he was trying to figure out what smart buildings mean, so he did a Google search.
I could have kept going.
Yeah. So those are kind of our opening slides. Do you want to start with you, John, while we're sort of on that?
Yeah, sure. In preparation for our theme for the month, which, we've all determined there's a lot of different interest on, but there's a lot of viewpoints. I just thought I'd do a quick search and something like there's 8 million hits on that or something. But, that aside, the interesting thing is you can click on lots of them and go to a valid story by, a knowledgeable organization, and it's their view. It's workspace management, it's lighting, it's this. And that gets us into kind of the conversation we've had on this and for years is, there's all these different systems. And in many cases, people are perfectly happy with buying a new IoT vertical system, and that's all it does. And it doesn't integrate, right? But it was quick, it was easy. The app's up on my iPhone. Well, why are you guys talking about all this complexity? I'm done. I got every piece of information. And really the complexity comes in when you want to do something with it beyond that vertical silo. And oftentimes the complexity increases so much that the owner or they can't even believe your story. Wait a minute. How can it cost me 5 times as much as I paid for that point solution to actually connect it to something to turn the lights on, right? So anyways, what are smart buildings? What are autonomous buildings? I think everyone in this call has some ideas, but we're going to have to wrestle with that to have this conversation over the month of February.
Yeah.
I just entered that in and got 1.3 billion returns.
No, you must have faster internet than me.
I got 800 million.
Oh.
Yeah.
John, I think it's so important that we get our language, our shared words here as a group. It's so important. In our space, we're fighting against this thing called IoT. IoT is something that I'd like to get on the table. What is IoT too versus is it just this thing connecting your washer and dryer up to the cloud? And I really believe in our world, the building automation world or industrial automation, IoT sells things short a little bit as you're starting to intimate to. So let's get our words right as we enter
words
this
matter.
month.
Yeah, the words
We'll
are.
hear about that from Glenn today. He has been talking about IoT from day one and actually providing great material as a reference source on how it's viewed by different segments of the industry.
Yeah, so looking forward to hear that. Ken, do you want to?
I think it's a good time to jump in because I don't know what a smart building is, so I'm still an old guy, so I still talk about building automation. And of course, I've been playing on that a bit, that it's not only just the noun building automation, it's the verb building automation. I think that's kind of the era we're entering into where we're building automation relationships between almost everything in our lives. So basically, I'm just trying to cap up our last month, which was basically reaching out to the workforce and defining the smart building workforce was the actual title. So what I've done is I've tried to pull together one URL that would be useful to send off to the high schools, tech schools, anybody who might be interested in our industry. And what I've tried to do is just on one URL, they can kind of flip through and get a quick view of what our industry is about. I've linked to some of the stuff we've been doing for the last 22 years. And we've got some of that in a flyover so they can actually, if they actually focused on the thing for about 4 or 5 minutes, they could get a pretty good idea of what our industry is. I'm a little afraid they may run away kicking and screaming and crying, but that's life. But it's also, there's a good life in there for us all. We've all had a good career. So I think that is an attraction. And building automation through the worst of times has always been good, and the best of times have been amazing. So I think that's a message we need to do as well. I've also got a link to on Saturday, I just did a session with Control Trends, and we just chatted a whole bunch about a whole bunch of things around the education, vocation, and basically just creating that passion. And I think that's another important piece we have to work on. I think, yeah, that's probably all I've got to say on that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ken. That sounds great. So Roger,
the other thing I did, I looked up autonomous buildings, but I don't know what anybody else did, which actually said an autonomous building is a building designed to be operated independently from infrastructural support services. So, without electric power, gas, and so on. So we've got plenty to talk about there. But yeah, what I was looking at was the empty buildings. I mean, it's surprising that it's, the grid's only down sort of 10%, but they're actually saying that some of that because the occupiers are obliged to keep that. But I would suggest there's probably doesn't need to be that high if it's, if a building's running, you could certainly run it more efficiently without people in it and still keep within some sensible limits. We know buildings have to be run to keep them, to keep them actually sustainable, etc. But I think, the other thing we're going to look at is in the longer term, there may be a lot more emptier offices. So I suppose it's almost a business opportunity for someone to say, hey, we can run empty buildings and make them more efficient for you, but still meeting the requirements and including your lease if you need to, or your legal ones.
Yeah, and on my slide, I kind of already commented on it. This was 1986, and if you actually read the article, it talks about the person that's been written about has been working on this for 3 years, so that's 80. That's a long time ago, but I thought that's interesting. Things haven't moved that much.
There's a few of us on the call that was just yesterday.
That's for sure.
Speak for yourself, Tracy.
That's right, Marky.
Sure.
Any other general comments before we figure out what smart means?
I just want to say, when I think about autonomous buildings and that language, I wonder if an analog, an interesting analog would be a super tanker going across the ocean, completely independent, autonomous, yet can be connected to the rest of the world using today's technology. I had a buddy of mine who was a chief engineer on a super tanker. You know, he'd be out at sea for 6 months at a time, and they had to be completely autonomous. They couldn't rely on anything. Is that even close, or is that something that's just crazy?
I think that's a great example.
Yeah.
Or a cruise ship.
Mm-hmm.
You actually have residents and stores and infrastructure that you would see in a city. I mean, cruise ships are basically floating cities at this point, right?
Yep.
And in that analogy, Bill, is the IoT, are they the Somali pirates in their speedboats zipping around trying to board?
That's cyber security right there. Right?
With no security, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I've been poking around with that, and Bill, you're into the RV business, and I was into the boating business. The idea of being off the grid and being autonomous, it hit pretty clear, and all of a sudden you understood when you're drinking beer and stuff. You're talking about DDC systems. I'm sorry, DC systems, not AC systems, and you're talking about how inefficient the inverter is converting AC back to DC, which of course everything uses. And I ruled that out, and I said, like, what if, what if we had won the current wars, and the DC systems had prevailed rather than the AC? If you kind of let your mind go, and the whole grid wouldn't be there, and every physical thing would become completely autonomous with its own power. And that's not so hard to think about. So it's an interesting thing. So, and I think that I love that definition of the autonomous building, that it is off the grid. And that's part of it. And that's starting to happen more and more. The demonstration buildings, which I'm always talking about the stuff that you guys, well, that's never going to happen. And it is happening, but it's happening at small scale. Eventually, bits and pieces of it will be scaled up.
Okay, so I brought in Glen. Hello, Glen. So you're muted right now. Maybe you can help us. Maybe you can explain why buildings are supposed to be smart. You are muted again.
You're remuted.
You unmuted, but you muted back.
There
you go.
Good.
You know, maybe I'm just getting too old for all this techie bullshit. Excuse my French.
Can't happen then.
Okay, so smart. Well, really, just to set a little bit of context, that word wormed its way into our vocabulary because we wrote this piece in the Harvard Business Review in 2005 called 4 Strategies for the Age of Smart Services. And I'm not aware of, I don't know, but I think it was the first piece ever written in similar journals around connected products and services that informs. And so the original motivation was just to try and perpetuate a word that was on a marquee publication that we could use to market ourselves with. But if you kind of go back, I mean, if you go back in my own evolution, I grew up more focused in the automation control space. If I go, pre-networked products back in the 90s and the 80s. And so I definitely found that automation control in everybody's mind had nothing to do with computing. So the sort of feed forward, don't use the word automation to describe any of this, was because I think people tended to default to assume that meant it was synonymous with control. And when, like people like the cellular people showed up to the store and started calling it machine to machine in the late 90s, I had no particular issue with that. It just kind of came and went and sort of disappeared into the ether. But the more we used the term, the more the motivation behind it was actually a pretty neutral term. I mean, to the earlier comments about IoT, I mean, I would just say 2 things. One is everybody has their own completely subjective, dependent definition of what that means. And I would just say, if you got 10 people in a room, you're going to get 15 definitions for IoT, and they're not very well aligned. And so the term is just kind of a loose cannon. If I was forced at maybe gunpoint to try and generalize how people use IoT, I think the other earlier comment I heard that I agree with was that people, I think, still think of that as having more to do with connectivity than software systems and other value elements within a larger solution. And so, it was either because it was kind of an aberrant term, everybody used it subjectively very different from each other, or the fact that it only meant a very limited definition of all this. The thing I have found written in public, which I don't know if people know who Brian Arthur is. He's a tech fluent economist, and he wrote a book, and I think about 2008 or 9, about how technologies work. And no one in my office will ever allow me to use this term, but he introduces the term combinatorial technologies. And kind of in the current time frame, what he's implying by that is that you have multiple parallel technology and innovation streams going on in the marketplace today. Think of cloud or compute infrastructure. Think of whatever, smart devices, sensors, et cetera, actuators, whatever. But of course, you also have a lot of software, data management, AI, machine learning, et cetera. His point is that like a Lego kit, these technologies combine and recombine with each other to create new capabilities. The simplest analogy would be like, I used to think of GPS in the context of satellites and telemetry, and now I've got it on my smartphone, and it's a combination of elements, therefore combinatorial, that equal that capability. But if I say add machine learning and AI and essentially software in general to the implied definition of IoT is connectivity, that's historically what we've meant by smart systems, and it is in the spirit of the combination of these technologies renders a system. But again, our attraction to that term has only been its neutrality. People tend not to use it subjectively. So it's a, at its worst, it's benign, and at its best, it's neutral. And in many respects, that was kind of the reason we've stuck with it, because nobody's ever really tried to co-opt it in this context. And so I love autonomy. The only piece of that word that I find a little bit maybe implicitly, well, it takes people out of the equation, and of course, people are always going to interact with these systems. And so, I'm writing a piece right now called "The Invisible Economy," and it's essentially about all the different little systems and subsystems of software that run in our lives unattended, and are beginning to propagate interactions and capabilities between and amongst themselves based on things like machine learning algorithms and models. And so I get the fact that you could run a building autonomously, and I think it has the same neutrality in terms of just how it would get used in the marketplace. I'm just not sure it covers the whole story completely end to end. I think the other piece of this was always, the physical world meets the general purpose computing world. Our client, a lot of this is, of course, driven by greed, but in order to service the diversity of clients we work with, whether it's IT systems, general enterprise software versus automation, control, sensing, or any of these in a more vertical context, like a smart building versus a smart home versus a smart factory, that neutrality in the terminology was always because I had to cover too many bases and too many constituents to saw the world wildly differently. So that's where it came from. I wouldn't defend it. I would just say it tends not to invoke wildly different definitions and context if you're careful how you explain it to people. Autonomous is good. I bet you have a lot of explaining to do when you get a bunch of people in the room, like, what do you mean by that? And but I think it's a valid term, because obviously a huge amount of these systems are aimed at automating an insane number of interactions between other systems, devices, and people, and so forth. And I think all of this, I guess my last bit here would be, all of this gets back to some kind of state-based, more deterministic or real-time context for systems. And, whether, like if you look at the evolution of the term cyber physical, to me, that was always just too much to say, and not very quick to understand intuitively. But in many respects, all of this is about physical real world computing meets, virtual, and And autonomous definitely does imply the ability to do things that have value in an application or usage context that relate to much more than I just connected the thing, or I just monitored the thing, or I just automated a particular function. I don't know if I'm being constructive or not, Anto.
You are.
Glenn, in listening to you, what you said is in 2005, you were able to help the industry adopt the word smart, and it's stuck. Basically it's stuck for 15 years. And sometimes we use intelligent in lieu of smart.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. But people are comfortable. Like I said, it doesn't provoke any strong reaction. Well, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. It's more, yeah, I get it. Smart, it's computerized.
Right. My joke, Steve, was always, it's like if you go into a room of multiple Protestant domination, it doesn't piss off the Methodists or the Presbyterians or the Episcopalians.
Right. So, whereas, and I agree with you, when you say IoT, it's everybody's, you're going to get 10 different opinions from all 10 people. The reason we started talking about autonomous is we felt like we're trying to throw some, trying to get the industry to evolve again, move into the next phase. And it's like, think of this as 2005, and you're about to call this industry something, and you're trying to say there's this trend that's emerging. Let's get a term that attempts to describe it, that might catch fire, that people might get excited about, and for legitimate reasons. And so what we're trying to help have a discussion around is autonomous that word. Might it be that word? And if not, why not? And should we look for something else instead?
I think it very well could be. I mean, what it does to, I mean, the nice thing is you have things like drones and autonomous vehicles. So people definitely have, whatever, analogous frame of reference around other things that have occurred. It does something that intelligent and smart doesn't do, which is it definitely pushes the envelope as it would relate to all these crazy vertical subsystems actually do need to interact in order to attain autonomy. That's kind of anybody who understands any definition of like an autonomous vehicle would have to understand that intuitively. And I think to some extent, that's always been the problem in the smart building space, is that everybody thinks of it in their own silos, but they don't necessarily think all the silos need to be interacting and operating and sharing data between and amongst themselves. And they're still kind of stuck in their own backyards.
Glenn, it's so interesting what's coming up from this conversation with Steve and all this. And I'm loath to stick a finger in anyone's eye generally, but if you think about our group here, we spent last month figuring out how to bring people into this industry. Now we're kicking off a month saying, we don't need you. So
half the people.
And you bring up a second excellent point about how systems have got to integrate with each other. And and John Petsy's been carrying this torch about, and many of us have, about, you can't just, John, what do you call those 1-point systems? These sort of whatever, where that's the opposite of version of an autonomous building, where you have all these disparate systems operating independently. So you bring up some very excellent points, in my opinion.
No, I think it's interesting as well, the fact that really I guess the challenge with buildings is most of the expertise to run the building is offsite, not on-prem. The thing you brought up earlier about the tankers or the ships, if they break down or something going on, they have the ability to fix it in-house, on the boat, and so on. Whereas buildings tend to be left to people who are now hopefully connected, whether it's FM guys, whether it's the people who can come in, but the expertise doesn't actually lie in the building. It's actually outside. So that connectivity is something that's still needed to the building to make it function, even if it's only an emergency or to actually, make it run better or whatever. But that it certainly needs that more than, say, a smartphone or a smart car, an autonomous car or an autonomous ship.
Yeah.
So Roger, I think in my opinion, you hit on something: connectivity. And I saw something last week where the overall connectivity penetration rates across building systems is only around 16%. So how can we go from smart to autonomous without connectivity? That's number one. Number two is that roughly of those 16% of these connected devices within the buildings, let me get this figure right, only 40 to 50% are realizing any type of economic value because there's no interoperability or any interconnectivity between these different systems, devices, et cetera. So just a kind of a point to kind of bring up here. And then lastly is ultimately when we talk about smart buildings, as you know, Glenn, I echo you get 10 people in a room, you get 15 different answers. Is ultimately, is there the common element, no matter how you define these, the business and the outcomes you're trying to achieve and what they're supposed to deliver?
So your point about connectivity was interesting because that basically means that single-digit % is actually getting any value out of connectivity from an integration perspective.
Right.
That
Sorry, go
goes
ahead.
towards the point that John mentioned when we were sort of in the warm-up period about the point solution. Do you want to sort of restate that? Because I thought that was very interesting, and that goes to the point solution point.
Yeah, I'd like to, because I'd like Glenn to comment on it. Hey, Glenn, because I just read your most recent,
Propaganda.
that too. No, because and I think part of the reason is I think we agree on a lot of those things, but the value will be unleashed when all these systems are connected so that they can work in a coordinated fashion towards better benefits. There's a range of them. But what we were talking about on the last call, and I'm potentially seeing a trend out there that owners are very enamored by and find it easy to buy a point solution. It does X, right? It's a vertical silo. It does X. It's fancy and it's IoT and it's all that, but it just does X. But it shows up on my phone really easy. And I got the value I needed, but it actually won't integrate easily with anything. Some I've encountered can't integrate at all, mainly maybe business rules that the company has set. But there seems to be an easier path for a lot of decision makers to buy that point solution. And then it's 2 years down the road, then they find, well, wait a minute, I can't get my meter data out to do this with it. I can't get my lighting. But there seems to be some simplicity to buying these fancy new shiny point solutions. And I wonder if Mark's, great numbers, Mark. Boy, I wish I had a trend on that, because I might even venture that it's going down because more of these point solutions are coming in. They're easy to buy. They're really fancy. And they're not being integrated because, hey, they did what I bought them for. And that's actually working against the things we know need to happen about these systems being able to share data, make decisions together, feed into supervisory optimization algorithms. It seems like this trend for the wrong reason is working against what we think the industry needs to accomplish.
Let me add a little bit.
Do you think that's coming because the parties that are creating those solutions aren't from within our industry?
I think that could be part of it, but I'm going to just put a psychological thing on it, right? I mean, you guys know we've been doing automation for a long time, right? I have two different security products, right, in my home. They don't talk to each other, but that one solved that problem. That one solved another one, and I'm too busy to mess around. Is that what's happening?
But I think if we take a look at the autonomous car industry, first of all, Bill's comment about it doesn't make the people, separate the people from the industry. If you look at how many people are working in the autonomous car industry, and then imagine if that gets applied to buildings, how many people that'll reach out to. That's sort of one comment. But the next comment is if you take a look at what is happening in the autonomous car, the spin-offs are falling right into the electric cars, that are being developed now. And that's what we would need, is that we need to shake our heads and start in a new direction, because it makes us think different. Now, the other thing about the integration, I think that's an interesting piece, because if you take a look at how the autonomous car has integrated a whole bunch of dynamic, I want to call them dynamic silos, different than just silos, and they are starting to use common databases to bring that back. And I think that's what Glen's saying. That's what I'm getting out of the stuff I'm reading from him, is that eventually we have to start normalizing some of this data. So actually, maybe back to you, Glen.
Well, I have two comments. I mean, one thing is, you know, the analogy with like an autonomous vehicle, the big difference is a building is basically built out of a bunch of spec systems, subsystems that, in other words, in the autonomous vehicle example, that's a complex, tightly integrated set of subsystems. And if they're not tightly integrated, then the car will kill you or kill somebody else, or at least get wrecked. But that tight coupling is a huge characteristic of that particular application of all these technologies that, you know, one can always make the argument from an optimization standpoint that if I more tightly coupled all the subsystems in a building, I'll get advantage from that. But is that, to John's point, viscerally or economically or both worth it? You know, do people see that as being worth it? I mean, you know, the other construct I've used for, I don't know, 15 years now is I say, look, all of this connectivity and integration of data from all these disparate systems really yields three classes of applications: simple, compound, and complex. And simple is like, you know, hub and spoke monitoring, or not even bidirectional monitoring. I know the status of something, and I've got alerts and alarms and, you know, pretty basic functions from that connectivity, but nothing much more. Compound, the definition we use is what we're talking about, which is essentially I can, you know, freely interoperate and utilize data across multiple subsystems within a given application, like whether it's asset management or building management or supply chain or energy or whatever. And complex is really implicitly heading towards that. And I'll now throw another word into the till just to spice up the story. I mean, really, it's complex adaptive systems is what autonomy is also, I think, synonymous with. And adaptive is another word I use a lot because it's easy and people don't misinterpret it. And well, semantics is like the besides eating and the rest of Maslow's hierarchy, it's trying to get whoever said it at the beginning of the call, trying to get people to share vocabulary is virtually impossible and hard to communicate to people without it.
So speaking of autonomous vehicles, so question I have for the group then. We look at who's the buyers of autonomous vehicles. We consumers.
Right.
Who autonomous building? It's a more business situation. Is there a difference between the business mentality and why will autonomous work in a business environment where you've got multiple decision makers? Building is, let's face it, the attitude for many building owners and operators is the lights are on, that's great. HVAC works, my security scan badge works. Okay, I'm not going to worry about anything else. So is the difference the audience themselves, and how do you influence the business community or the building owners and operators?
Mark, with your comment there, it's interesting because it's something I'm kind of still passionate about, is that the thing that concerns me that's holding back a lot of this, I believe, is the contractual chain. Because, you know, when something's being built, is the chiller, the guy who's selecting the chiller talking to the light guy? Is the lighting guy talking to the security people, the building automation people, and all the other systems? No, they're not. It's all kind of done in isolation right at the early stage. Whereas there should be a responsibility. There's always going to be variations. You know, phones, you can have Android or Apple or whatever, but, you know, and there will be different choices, but at least you could make one choice, say this building's going to be, you know, whatever. And that's the way it would work. At least then everything could potentially communicate. But because that contractual chain is not really driven you know, as one exercise. It's all over the place. That this really, you know, the technology could be done. I don't think this is. I honestly don't believe this is a technology issue.
Yeah.
I think it's more of a contractual issue.
Roger, picking up on what you said about the contracting chain, when you get done installing systems, the notion is you're turning it over to the owner to run it. And I think that's the assumption I would say that doesn't, most cases doesn't work. If we could, if the thinking instead was we're going to turn it over to companies that are experts in remotely managing systems, all of a sudden, all this power that we've engineered into our systems can be taken advantage of. We can optimize the energy, we can optimize the maintenance, we can do all the wonderful things we want to do if the buying process was such that, no, I'm not turning it over to the owners because the owners don't know what to do. They're terrible at it for the most part. We turn it over to companies that specialize in remote management of buildings who have the expertise. And John introduced me to a company, I won't mention their name, that he does work with out in California, that's what they do. But there's lots of others out there that, you know, are effective in this regard. That changes things because now this idea of intelligent remote management or intelligent remote managed services is the way to actually get to where we want to get the industry to go, because it does take that expertise and it doesn't live in building engineers for the most part. They're too busy trying to keep.
I mean, Steve, I think that's a great point, but the fundamental question is we know that the building engineers struggle with operating this, but fundamentally, do the building owners care about the value that we've been trying to bring for the last 30 years as a motivator?
They don't, or
sorry, Glenn.
they'd be willing to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not sure about that. I know.
And when value exceeds price, there's a sale every time, and clearly we're not crossing that threshold somewhere.
Well, I think economically, it's either the thing has such a very high and overt economic value, like factories and semiconductor fabs, where people will spend a ton of money to make sure those things are optimized because of the asset value, both it's up front and it's installed in, you know, economic use cases. Insane, it's off the charts.
Yeah, so let me jump in. Take a look at the chat. There's some real gold, Anto, in that chat today.
I know, I'm looking, yeah.
So what Tracy just said and what Steve just said, no, I mean, so Tracy just said when cost exceeds value, I'm going to suggest it's if you can get the context to exceed the cost, all right? Call it value or whatever. And somehow these IoT guys are being able to bring a context that the cost doesn't matter. So if you look at this chat, what can we learn from these 1 point people to bring some pop and sizzle? How would, like Steve suggests, how can we adjust our products and services to match that 5-year mentality that some of you were talking about in the chat? I mean, there's some real gold about adjusting language, adjusting models to meet these needs. I don't think cynicism is the way to go. I just think context, words, and an adjustment. I'm not suggesting anyone here was cynical.
I'm pretty snake bit.
Yeah. I think they're hitting it in the chat too. I think the proprietary nature of the silo and protectionism is a big part of that, compared to a vehicle manufacturer with they've got to get everything integrated. That's the only way it will go. There's just not an incentive going here for anyone. The value does not exceed the price somewhere in the chain here to the people that are writing the checks.
Yeah, look at what Brian Turner just said. You got to solve problems. Adding value when problems are top of mind is fruitless. So these guys from Silicon Valley are coming in, hitting the problems right away, getting them solved. I mean, it's a good point.
I have a question for you. You've been keeping track of the industry for some time. We all saw Cisco come into the industry some years ago. Right? And now we're seeing the others come in, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, et cetera, with the concept of digital twin. Can you comment on that and how you see the industry trends emerging here with those large players?
Well, I mean, I guess my bottom line in digital twin is great concept. So as soon as you get agreement on how to organize the data to feed the digital twin, let me know. Because at the pace the evolution of the market has moved in, we could wait quite some time before, in other words, I can go build it in the lab, but how easy is it to stand up that kind of solution? Really, in other words, it crosses that line in the context of like a compound system or an adaptive system into, I have to have some degree of interoperability and some agreed upon terms to organize data in order to realize that representation of the system in a manner that allows me to then play with it and optimize it and do things with it. And just, John, Betsy, you know this, hard to get people to agree on data definitions and terms and understand the value of all that.
Yeah, it's brutally slow. It's taken far longer than it should. And you identified one of the problems. Most cases, I think we're talking about haystack tagging and metadata, is people don't realize the problem it solves or even that they have the problem. I can't tell you how many times. Because they haven't been trying to truly integrate data. If you buy one manufacturer system, this is handled, right? These are the names, this is how I find them, here's where they are in the menus and the trees. Well, when you're trying to bring it together, then the data semantics matter. And what I found is that people don't realize that. And so many times people come to me and go, oh, now I get it. Right. I had no idea why this was needed because I wasn't trying to connect and work with data from dissimilar systems where I'd need the metadata, right? But yeah, on the digital twin thing, you really can't argue with what the end potential could be. Well, but I fundamentally don't understand how you get there cost effectively. Lots of science projects, but in seeing how hard it is to integrate things to do the basics, wow, who's got the money to build out all of these models from diverse system data and semantic models?
And I don't mean to sound cynical, but that it plays right back to lots of manufacturers' advantage, which is I can build a twin of the thing I've got, that reinforces that particular manufacturer's ability to enable that. How quickly will people be sharing different, can I do this with 2 pumps from 2 manufacturers? Beats me.
We are seeing some sparks of it here, particularly in the UK, where, if you own a building, the first thing you do is sell it and lease it back, right? That's, a trend that's been going on for a long time. So the real estate guys, the REITs, are now really employing, smart people, really understand buildings and get it. And when they're defining a building, they're actually employing an MSI to actually help them, manage the consultants and the contractors to define what those standards should be so that at least things are going to work in unison. I'm not saying it's 100% right, but at least these are the people that actually own the building. They know that their occupiers, for want of another word, are going to transition. They're probably going to transition even quicker over the next few years because the leases will be shorter. So they're going to have good buildings because people are going to want, the whole well-being thing. They're going to want all the good things that you'd expect out of a building because there'll be a buyer's market. So I think the real estate guys could be key to it if they really get on it, when they're actually having buildings built or retrofitting, refurbishing, because they are the owners. It's not the occupiers. The occupiers are transitional.
Right, and I agree with the earlier comment about, in other words, this is very attractive as a service. In other words, sooner or later, Jim, Lee, you can comment on this, Dr. No. Sooner or later, these systems will become software defined enough, and the tools that underlie that software defined automation will be simple enough to use that it would be easier for a third party to orchestrate a lot of data values to optimize and manage, because I don't think the owner operators, and in other words, the traditional personas in this space aren't, well, some are, many aren't motivated to want to understand how to do that. But I do believe it could be an economically valuable service at some point when this stuff finally plugs and plays. But hopefully in my lifetime.
So a thought occurred to me that we were talking about point solutions, and the way we've been talking about point solutions, they are the very definition of not connected to each other,
right?
Which is the very definition of autonomous, right? So Is there a model whereby the systems that go into buildings are like that they are very lightly coupled and only connect when they need to get some information, and they sort of operate autonomously on their own, but collectively you have this sort of autonomy made up of all of these different systems? Is that a model that could work?
Yeah, it's like
I don't think it is, Anto, because I think that a lot of the shiny new objects that John's talking about are just that, and that they're systems and solutions that are pervaded by people that don't understand the time constants in buildings. So for those who have been around a while or understand the ecosystem, most of the stuff we put in has 10, 20, 30-year lifespans. I would posit that the Ring doorbell is not going to have that lifespan. Not that you won't have a Ring doorbell or something like it, but it will evolve at a much higher rate.
Yeah, I have to echo Jim's sentiments on that, Anto, too. I think, we put a VAV box up in the ceiling space in the last 20 years, and these technologies are solving specific business problems. And even when that business owner moves on, I think that solution evaporates or changes or morphs. So it's very permeable at the moment.
I used to go into commercial real estate buildings and look at the automatic meter reading systems in them. I mean, even with a 10-year-old building, maybe a 15-year-old building, you would find 3 different metering systems. Somebody ripped it out, put a new one in, put a new one in over that, put a new one in over that. No one actually even said, hey, we've already got a metering system. We should fix the one we have. That's not how they acquired it.
That is a real problem. And I'll give you a more current example in restaurants, which are arguably turned more frequently than any other building out there, right? It is very common for us to go in and be the 3rd or 4th lighting control system in a building that was probably turned less than 7 years ago. Happens all the time, all the time.
Is it's too costly to figure out the one that's there. It's just like tear it out, put in a new one.
Yep, there's no continuity in the knowledge base.
And they build that cost in and don't complain about it at that time. But if you try to come back to do some integration work, it's like, you want what for what?
In the cases I've seen, John, they don't even know that it's there. They don't know that they've already got 3 systems. They just don't know.
That's true.
So Tracy, have you ever, I don't know enough about your company, but do you offer an option to do a complete managed service for running the automation for your customers?
The stuff and here's the economics, right? We have very little interest in figuring out what those previous systems did, right? Why would we? At best, we might make use of an existing contactor panel, but replace the smarts with our smarts because our smarts are connected, right? So we absolutely do a managed service for that part of the business, and it's a monthly recurring thing.
Yeah.
And yep.
Yeah, I just think
we'll install our equipment, and we own the equipment, and we're responsible for maintaining it.
Yeah, I just think from my experience with the IT industry that a lot of companies, and very big ones, Deutsche Bank outsourced all its IT to Hewlett Packard. So there's a trend there. If the IT industry is willing to outsource running the IT, that means the help desk, everything. Why wouldn't our industry be able to have a similar approach? It certainly can, and I think we're better positioned to take advantage of the technology than. But if all we're trying to do is sell a box or a piece of software and then turn over the execution of it to the internal folks, that's hard to do because they don't really want to learn it. But if you give them a complete solution, I'll run it for you. But you got to take in, I don't think you can necessarily piecemeal as much. I think you got to look at the whole picture, which means you got to take the calls, the trouble calls, and the comfort calls and communication calls and everything related to the system.
Yeah, and each building type is different. Arguably, what makes our business model work in that market is because of the turnover. And we offer some level of continuity, but at the same time, if the building is sold to somebody else, restaurant chains sell off stuff all the time, it starts all over again. The sales process starts all over again. There's, as opposed to a new buyer who comes into a building and says, what do you mean the rooftop units don't come with the building? I don't understand that, you know, so that's like a commercial building. You know, the HVAC equipment comes with the building, and buildings last a very long time, but owners don't. So that's an issue too.
Fair.
Yeah, there's you know, we always talk about silos, right? Meaning HVAC lighting and stuff, but there's almost like a temporal silo that different periods of the particular building has completely different building systems and different owners that don't talk to the previous one. Interesting. So what do you suggest, Glenn? What should we do with this question? What's the answer?
Well, once again, the building space in general ends up being this like bag of snakes and worms as it relates to all of these little eccentricities and buying behaviors and usage behaviors. And I mean, what a rat's nest. And so it's hard to think about. In other words, I think autonomy and autonomous have some potential power. In other words, in the part of the book where I'm trying to get people to pay attention to this in a new way, I think it potentially is a decent catalyst, if not a good one, to try and do that. The problem is you got to kind of explain it because of all those different behaviors, and because I'm not sure people won't start doing what they do to so many other terms, which is applying their own definition to it. So unattended, it might be a dangerously whatever, misleading or different leading or diverse leading term. Attended well or put in a context could be, could be a powerful story.
So then what you're saying is that we in the industry, are we stuck in building purgatory?
Well,
I thought he was saying we're the rats.
Yeah, and the snakes.
You're atoning for your sins, Mark.
Glenn, I thought you said that was the utility industry.
That's true. You were there. Betsy was there too. I did that again recently. Anyway, well, of course, no ill will towards all of our participants together. I just, I mean, to some extent, the thing that people need to pay attention to is, it was the simplest term I could come up with. Mostly this is about optimizing all these systems, and all the things we just talked about are the things that make that so hard to do. So whether I'm trying to orchestrate things or optimize things or make them autonomous, it all implies the same, just whatever, higher level of integration and more interoperability between and amongst these things in order to achieve that. So I'm neutral on the term autonomous, but I'm definitely up for the idea of a new way of describing things, because things need to cycle. Like, I need to read a new novel, even if it's on an old topic, but with a fresh view. And this is a space that could use a little airing. There've got to be, at least my impression is, a lot more interesting services, a lot more interesting ways that buildings are getting managed, even if it's not that many of them. Mark, to your point, 16%, that's a depressing number. Jesus.
And I think, this whole COVID thing, not to bring that up because we don't want to get into discussion, but something really came out for me as a result is that this concept of smart buildings, again, define it however you want to, is we still have so many buildings out there globally that are dumb, that aren't even have one little bit of smartness to them. And a good example was when we all stopped going in the office and, building and owner operators were looking at their energy spend, and they're running their buildings at full energy occupancy, and there's nobody in the buildings. And they were not letting people back into the buildings to do it, manually. But so the point is that as an industry, I look at this, we talk about the next thing. President Bartlett used to have this thing on West Wing. When he was tired of talking about something, he would go, what's next? And they would move on. Is that something we as an industry can afford to do? Start talking about what next. Let's talk about what's now and the things that are happening, because the technology exists. It's the building owners and operators who, many of them are not taking advantage of it.
Right.
It's tough. If you ask a homeowner, an enlightened homeowner, and, do you have a smart home? And they say, yes. And you say, well, tell me about it. Well, I have a Ring doorbell and I have an ADT security system and I have Samsung TVs and I have, it's all independent, disparate systems.
Point solution.
Yeah. And I don't envision the Ring doorbell guys sitting around thinking about, how can I make my data integratable with the Google Nest doorbell guys' data? Right? There's no incentive for them to do any of that. Our industry, we just know there's a better way to run these bigger buildings, and it's frustrating when we can't pull it all together. But I gotta say, sometimes I feel like I'm howling at the moon here. I'm whining and crying about a problem that nobody wants to solve. It's just crazy.
Well, I mean, I think there's three classes of behaviors that go on. There's stuff that relates to comfort and convenience, and stuff that relates to security and whatever other utilitarian things that flow with that. But safety and security, and there's kind of a third, which is just efficiency and essentially costs and efficiencies. And I think those justifications or motivations or requirements don't necessarily in the building space get thought of in an integrated manner very often. They tend to be pursued in their own context, which just reinforces the whole argument. So, whether it's autonomous or different characterization, something that obviously pretty clearly implies that there's a lot of value from the integration and optimization of these systems would be useful to the because it seems like that behavior is still fairly entrenched, that whether it's in the context of a point system, siloed data, or I'm just doing this over here for security, I'm doing that over there for convenience, and never shall the twain meet.
That was the thinking that we started with when we came up with the autonomous building discussion. We need different terminology just to get everybody to stand back for a moment and say, wait, let's think about this differently. Maybe there is a better way. Yeah. So at least that's what I was hoping.
Which I think is, worth exploring, because you do fall into a trap depending on what's in this space. A lot of traps using old terminology because it's been around for a long, long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's at the top of the hour, so we need to start to wrap up. Maybe Glenn, I can give you the last word to sort of, it's a nice little bow for us.
Well, as soon as we can get the industry away from this kind of blind leading the vision impaired. But I think it's, one thing to consider in all of this beyond just the term that moves the discussion into a different or new or fresh context would be, there's always this huge behavioral dimension to this space that has been a huge, the behavior and its defaults is a constraint to that kind of fresh view. So, might be worth testing this assumption with an interesting group or cross range of people, just because it's the behaviors that tend to malign, twist, and screw up these terms and how they get used, and see if something's useful.
That's interesting. That's wonderful. So, okay, so let's wrap up. That's a great way to conclude this conversation, and we're going to continue the journey from smart to autonomous for the rest of February. I'm wondering if that journey is going to be autonomous or not, but let's put that to one side.
Can I come back for more torture?
Sure.
I mean, dialogue.
Yeah.
I'm just
I'll holler
kidding.
at you all
Glenn,
day.
purgatory. Join
I
us.
know. Listen, I'm just being an asshole. It's Monday afternoon.
All right.
Glenn, thanks for joining us. Great to
Yeah,
see
listen, thanks everyone for inviting me. It's a great group of faces to see again. We should do this more often. So maybe next week. But listen, everybody have a safe and productive week. And thank you very much personally for, it's nice to see you all again. Really appreciate it.
Glenn.
Great
Back
seeing
at you, Glenn.
Thanks.
Thanks, Glenn.
Take care.
Thank you, Glenn. And the video will be up tomorrow morning, and we'll see you again next week at 3 o'clock, Monday Live.
Cool.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Later.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.